And so just to get us started, I wanted to ask you about sort of the main framing devices that you use to write the book, specifically the notion of inchoate interdisciplinarity and embryonic intersectionality. And I think this is something that is really distinct about the contribution. Of course, there are so many different kinds of Du Boises, and there's a debate amongst philosophers about who Du Bois is. And yet you're framing the very question in an innovative way. And I just wanted sort of in beginning our conversation for you to speak to that, to speak specifically to this question of Du Bois, understanding Du Bois as an interdisciplinary and intersectional thinker.
Yeah, wow. I really, really appreciate the question. It is a great honor to be here with you. Shout out your latest book. Thanks so much. Major contribution to Du Bois studies. But to engage Du Bois as an interdisciplinary figure, his pedigree, his own intellectual trajectory speaks to it. Du Bois is a figure who studies at Fisk University, as you know, classics, Greek, Latin, literature. So he's already has this sort of interdisciplinarity hardwired into him at an HBCU. So it's very important before we get to Harvard, we've got to grapple with Du Bois at an HBCU, at a historically Black college or university, Fisk, right? University. And so for me, it starts there. Then he goes, as you know, he graduates from graduates from Fisk in 1888, goes to Harvard, studies with William James, George Santayana, among several of the major early American philosophers, if you will, at Harvard, gets his BA in 1890. He is discouraged from pursuing further work in philosophy and takes on history because there's no such thing as sociology at this point, right? At least not in the United States of America. There are no departments, if you will, of sociology. So his interdisciplinarity is already hardwired into his graduate training, his undergrad and graduate training, his collegiate years. And then he does something very unusual for an African-American at the end of the 19th century. He goes to the University of Berlin and studies in the Department of Political Economy, yet another discipline. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's something strange happens when people try to force Du Bois's feet into some too tight shoes, which is one academic area, when he's already exploding out of various disciplines, right? And the walls of disciplines were not as hard and fast as they are today. Some of it has to do with academization, professionalization. Some of it has to do with the political economy of the American Academy and the Academy in general, that people have to get tenure, right? Mm-hmm. People have to do certain things to write into the Academy. And what if, Elvira, Du Bois isn't an academic? Mm-hmm. Du Bois is an intellectual. See, an academic's work is quarantined to the Academy. Du Bois is a bona fide intellectual because his work actually has a life outside of the Academy and actually in the community. This is how he ends up founding the NAACP. So not only is his work is critically engaging the campus, but it's also critically engaging the community. That's what's going to be really important to understand about Du Bois as being a bridge. And this is, as you know, at the heart of what we call Black studies, the emergence of Black studies in the 1960s. They said that a Black studies student, a Black studies scholar, should be a bridge from the campus to the community and from the community to the campus. So that's how, to a certain extent, me bringing a more Africana studies or an African-American studies interpretation to Du Bois, which is always already interdisciplinary. So I'm not negating philosophy and all the training I did with Lucius Turner Outlaw Jr., right? My dissertation director, Lucius Outlaw, shout out to Dr. Outlaw. And so that's the deep interdisciplinarity. And I want you to hear that term, deep interdisciplinarity. Is not the sort of academic. I feel like we got a lot of imposters saying that they're doing interdisciplinary work, but they're not. Is it really interdisciplinary? So that's the interdisciplinarity part. Intersectionality and embryonic. So Elvira, one of the things I really want to slow down, I want to dial it down just for a second. The argument isn't, in the book, the argument is not that Du Bois is an intersectionalist on the scale of a Kimberly Crenshaw or a Patricia Hill Collins and so on and so forth. It's embryonic, meaning that this is the formative phase of a theory of something that is really going to blossom at the end, right, of the 20th century. Let me shout out Combahee River Collective, 1977. In their Black Feminist Manifesto, they articulate something that's called identity politics, right? So that's 1977. 12 years later, in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw is going to drop intersectionality. And it's that seed of looking at the ways in which race and racism, gender and sexism, patriarchy, class and capitalism, colonialism and racial colonialism, how do these various things intersect and interlock in our lives, right? In the way that we approach not simply ourselves, but the world. If you're talking about intellectuals, the way we approach our work, right? The kinds of topics that we understand to be important or not so important. What's at the center of our discourse and what's at the margins? And for me, some of the most provocative aspects of Du Bois's thought, his discourse, have actually been marginalized in a lot of Du Bois's discourse, and a lot of the Du Bois studies discourse.
Wow. I have a follow-up, but I would just want to invite you to say a little bit more about what are those essential contributions in contemporary Du Bois scholarship that you think have been marginalized?
Well, Du Bois's contributions to what would have been called at the time, and what we call right now, Black feminism, and particularly the discourse, Elvira, on Black male feminism. The fact that there's a long tradition of African-American men in particular who have been incredibly committed to women's rights. And in my own work, I talk about women's decolonization and women's liberation, because I don't know about you, but I was socialized in an incredibly sexist society. So I'm literally socialized to be a little patriarchal pig, to be a sexist, to be a misogynist. And I have to consciously critique that. I have to challenge that. And so there's a long tradition going back to Frederick Douglass, right? In 1857, Frederick Douglass delivers this incredible speech, and it's called, "I'm a Radical Women's Rights Man." As you know, Frederick Douglass is the only man to address the first major convention on women's rights in this country in Seneca Falls, right? And so again, there's a long tradition of African-American men who have been deeply and profoundly committed to women's decolonization and to women's liberation. But if we're only sort of reading Du Bois into a Western European or European American philosophical tradition, we're gonna miss Du Bois's dialogue with Douglass, Du Bois's dialogue with Alexander Crummell, Du Bois's dialogue with Booker T. Washington. Check this out, Elvira. Du Bois's dialogue with Dr. Anna Julia Cooper, Du Bois's dialogue with Mary Church Terrell, Du Bois's dialogue with Ida B. Wells.
If I can follow up on what you were saying earlier, in thinking about what it means to be a public intellectual, as sort of having a more adequate or honest account of what interdisciplinarity really is and the way that it works for Du Bois. I mean, how is he imagining the work of a thinker? And specifically, it seems like he's responding to the lived experience of a non-ideal racist society, so that the concept of race and his own embodiment, when he's looking out into a fundamentally broken world disfigured by violence, is that he is seeing white supremacy, and part of his sort of call to act and to speak and to engage and to write, and each sort of contribution that he's making to sociology, philosophy, journalism, is sort of a testament to the lived experience of racial embodiment as it's structured by a white supremacist society. So, and this is sort of a way to think about sort of what you were describing, right? Of sort of the interdisciplinarity that's animating him taking this role of becoming a Black public intellectual. But also, I think it touches on a little bit in chapter 1 of what ends up becoming his monumental contributions to the development of sociology. So I was just wondering, sort of, if you could say a little bit more about any of that.
Wow, this is a dissertation question. I could write a whole I could write a whole dissertation on this. But if I can sort of tease some of this out, the question is so provocative because Du Bois is a figure who enabled me to see how artificial and arbitrary academic disciplines are. See, that mainstream conceptions of sociology, mainstream conceptions of history, of psychology, of economics, of literature, you name it, that might fit for the people that actually set up these colonial, academies. But what about those of us that have actually been colonized? This is where we have to go to the work of Frantz Fanon, right? Talks about the colonized and the colonizer. We could also nod to the work of Albert Memmi, right? And so it's really fascinating to sort of think about what happens if we can look at the academy, if we can look at things from the point of view of the most marginalized, of the most oppressed, of the people that have had race projected onto them, as opposed to, again, I have no great love affair with race, neither did Du Bois, but we know that we have to deal with anti-Black racism. Therefore, I have to study race then to understand why. I mean, this is where I can nod to Lewis Gordon's work in Black existentialism, like that existential, right, experience of anti-Black racism. And in fact, I don't consider necessarily Du Bois is an African-American public intellectual, and he's also just an iconic American public intellectual. And in fact, go to the work of Ross Posnock, talks about there's no way to conceive of a modern intellectual in the United States of America without grappling with Du Bois. And you develop your intellectual identity without grappling with Du Bois, you do so at your own peril. See, you're not going to be sufficiently intellectual. You might be a good little academic, but I don't know if you're really going to understand. Du Bois helps to give us a major model for American intellectualism. Yes, he's African American, but I think if Du Bois were a white man, nobody would put you're a great white public intellectual. I don't think they would do that, Elvira. I think there's a sense in which some people are missing the universality of the African American experience, and Du Bois is both, much like Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes is a great poet. Langston Hughes isn't just a great Black poet. Langston Hughes is a great poet, period. Toni Morrison is an iconic novelist. She's not a great Black novelist. She is a great African-American novelist, but she's so much more. And I think that the way that Blackness plays itself out in the American social imagination sometimes trips people up from seeing the universality, the profundity, the creativity, the complexity of African-American lives and struggles. So all I'm saying is with the book, and the reason I wrote a critical introduction is that, Elvira, you and I both know there are Du Bois studies as a discourse is brimming. It is exploding. It's like some people are saying we're going through a Du Bois renaissance, right? That the closer we get to 2023, the souls of Black folk will be 120 years old. And there's so many centennials that are going to start happening of Du Bois's work. Darkwater, the centennial was last year. That there's a sense in which some people are sort of missing Du Bois as a model, period, not as a great Black model. See, nobody ever says that Karl Marx is a great Jewish German model for intellectualism. No, they just say Karl Marx is a great model. They never say, well, Michel Foucault is a great French philosopher, model, philosophical model, boom, boom. No, they say he's a great philosopher. Jürgen Habermas. Nobody ever say, he's a great German. They just say he's a great philosopher. With us, they have to put these racial signifiers. They have their ways in which they do. I'm pretty sure a lot of people refer to you as a great female philosopher. No, listen, Dr. Basevich, you are a great philosopher, right? Period. Now, again, if somebody wants to read into the gender and the gender components of that, great. But I think primarily, I'm saying you're a great philosopher. I read your book cover to cover. You're a great philosopher. You understand what I'm saying? You're gonna get me started.
That's very kind of you. I hope to one day live up to it. I love what you're saying, and I think it speaks to the controversy that Du Bois held on to the fact that he's an American. And there's a way that he came to sort of redefine what it means to be an American, what it means to build a democratic community in the light of the specific legacy that we've inherited. That I think in my mind is something that is so profound and is so difficult to sort of, for me at least, to really work through, because of course, I think part of sort of the way I hear you, what you're saying is, at least for philosophers, right? When Du Bois is sort of read as just a Black philosopher or a Africana philosopher, that's a way that a lot of, as the late monumental Charles Mills would say, of white stream philosophy, they're covering their ears, because now, like, whatever is happening is not relevant to me. That's not what I'm writing on. It doesn't impact the way we conceptualize the concept of freedom, democracy, citizenship, all of the things that are veiled, as Du Bois would describe it. And yet, what I also find so interesting, and this is sort of what you're bringing out, is that the particularity of the experience, right? The specificity of the Black experience in America is essential to actually having a concrete universal, or to having an account of what it means to be in America and hold on to, even if it's possible, a viable conception of a democratic community here. And I just find that play, this dialectic that Du Bois is working with, really interesting and really
Can I jump in here? I think that I would not be me if I didn't shout out Kwesi Wiredu. Kwesi Wiredu, the great Ghanaian philosopher, has a book called Universals and Particulars. Mm-hmm. And he's saying that at the heart of what we call African philosophy, at the heart of what we call Africana philosophy, is this toggle between universals and particulars. What if Du Bois is both? Mm-hmm. Elvira, what if, in my mind, Du Bois is an incredible internationalist, but also an African-American nationalist on certain issues, right? Not on everything, but on certain issues. What if, see, at the heart of my work is the possibility of moving beyond either or. And I've been influenced by the Black feminists. I've been influenced by the Black queer, Black trans study scholars. We can be both and. See, I can be both a feminist, a male feminist, and a hip hopper. We got something for that. Joan Morgan created hip hop feminism. So we don't have to be both and. We don't have to be either or. We can be both and. Du Bois is both a great African-American, right, intellectual, interdisciplinary figure, intersectional figure, and he's also a great quote unquote American. He's also, at this point, a global intellectual. Let's be honest. Talk about public intellectual. Let's talk about global intellectuals. Those of us that are going around the world trying to decolonize people's minds, right? Trying to really help to raise people's consciousness, which is why I think that the work that the philosopher 1923 is doing is so important, because what happens when we make philosophy, when we demystify it? Mm-hmm. What happens when we move beyond the jargon that that they shove down our throats in grad school? What happens when we move beyond a lot of that and stop publishing simply in spaces that only 200 or 300 of our friends are going to read that journal? What happens? In writing this book, I wanted to create an introduction to Du Bois that I could actually go give to undergrad students. People keep saying, what is all of the fuss about this Du Bois guy? Why do I need to? So Professor Rabaka, you're saying I should not graduate from the University of Colorado at Boulder if I have not read and really engaged Du Bois. I will not really understand the value of a bachelor's degree in the United States of America if I don't grapple with someone whose mother died when he was 16 years old on March 23rd, 1885, who the father was never around since he was a toddler, who's basically, he describes himself as an orphan, as you know. Mm-hmm. How is it that this orphan, the only, Black child in his whole high school, Elvira, how is he able to get 2 bachelor's degrees,
Mm.
the equivalent of 2 master's degrees, the equivalent of 2 PhDs by the time he's 27 years old at the end of the 19th century. Now, the man is born 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 3 years after Juneteenth. How is he able, how is that? So if Du Bois was not Black, we would be saying he's the greatest American intellectual probably of all time. But Blackness, see, Blackness allows them to make Du Bois either an exception to many liberal, white Black, he's going to be the exception to the rule. Instead of saying why Du Bois might be the measure through which many of us should measure, to really sort of grapple with whether we are sufficiently philosophical, sociological, political, economic, so on and so forth.
That was beautiful.
Oh, well, thank you.
I want to sort of return to something we touched on, we've been discussing about the relationship to the universal in particular, and give you the opportunity to speak a little bit about one of the things that I really found, one of the many things that I found so helpful and interesting in the book, and something that, in my view, philosophers have wholly neglected, which is the idea of second sight. And your treatment of it in the book, it's consistent, it's innovative, and I loved it so much because it's speaking exactly to this question of, we take the particularity of the experience of double consciousness and present it in all of its harrowing detail, right, as a basis of pain and unrepaired moral injury. And yet for Du Bois, as you laid out, that's not the end of the story. It's also the basis for moral insight and transformation, that if we're going to have a radically reconstituted democracy or a sense of any kind of social harmony, we have to sort of mediate and collectively reflect on and find a language to appreciate and really see second sight. And it's this way of sort of how the particular could come to sort of redefine what we understand as a universal moral truth, right? Something like, let's say, respect, mutual respect. So I just would love to hear you say more about it and sort of how this concept is so central in Du Bois and I think neglected.
Would you permit me to be philosophical and show you my interrelation with Western European philosophy? There's a great philosopher whom I love. His name is Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault articulates and contributes a conception of subjugated knowledge. What if Du Bois, came to that conclusion? He just called it second sight in the souls of Black folk. And again, I'm saying this without in any way disavowing Michel, right? But I'm saying though, what if various cultures have concepts? Right here, I'm in Boulder, Colorado. So this is, Arapaho land. So indigenous people in these Americas have deeply and profoundly philosophical concepts that because their skins are not white, because they don't speak the English language, because they may not be male or heterosexual or whatever the situation may be, people marginalize that discourse. They subjugate it. Du Bois is saying, much like Michel Foucault, 50, 60 years later, Du Bois is saying that through African Americans, through African peoples, through non-white folks' experience of racial colonialism, through our experience of anti-Black racism, knowledge comes along with that. So there is the cursed, there is the curse of the actual feeling the stinging darts of racism that we experience, but there's also the blessing of it. It makes me more compassionate when I see people suffering. Right? It makes me more open to the fact that so much of my masculinity, so much of my manhood is actually informed by my grandmothers and my mother who raised me. I actually think that women have some very special insights to contribute to masculinity, right? I really do, because in a patriarchal society, it's the people that are not in positions of power that often can offer us some of the most compassionate, beautiful vulnerable, radically honest conceptions of who we really are. When Du Bois says second sight, Du Bois is essentially saying, America, you have based an entire society on racial capitalism. You've colonized, you've enslaved, you've committed cultural genocide. The very people that you colonize, this is the connection between Du Bois and Fanon, the very people that you have racially colonized, you actually may have to, or you should, grapple and engage with them, create real human relations with them if you want to rescue and reclaim your humanity. Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, he says that the colonizer actually becomes out of touch with their own humanity. They erode, they dehumanize themselves by trying to dehumanize the people they're racially colonizing. That's one of the great truths of The Wretched of the Earth, that in colonizing somebody, you actually end up colonizing yourself. In attempting to dehumanize people, you actually end up dehumanizing yourself. And as a Du Bois scholar, Du Bois, as you know, the Du Boisian method is, if you identify a problem, you must also identify a solution. You have a moral obligation as a social scientist to offer up a viable solution. You can also see where I'm nodding to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. That's at the heart of critical theory. You and I both know that if we identify a social problem, we should also offer up a social solution. So the solution to dehumanization would be rehumanization. What if I read The Souls of Black Folk, and what if I read Du Bois's entire discourse as a counter to dehumanization? We have to rehumanize ourselves. And Elvira, that means that we have to grapple with cultures that may have been defeated by racial colonialism and racial capitalism. We have to grapple with women's culture. We have to really, what knowledge can women and girls provide us with? What knowledge can queer and trans folk offer us? Like, see, if you see, I'm epistemically open. Some people are epistemically closed. Du Bois was epistemically open. He was, meaning he was open to knowledge that comes from anywhere and anyone, so long as it's going to help us get free. Do I sound like an American pragmatist right now? See, I'm trying to grapple. I'm reading the Frankfurt School because they developed this incredible critique of anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking, like, what ways can I build on that to develop a critique of anti-Black racism in the United States of America?
Well, we also have to grapple with white people.
You better watch out now.
And so, I mean, and this is what, I think this is part of sort of, I mean, obviously it's part of the problem. So having a moral subject that could receive the knowledge that you're describing, that deserves to hear it, that is in a position to truly understand it, that has earned enough trust to be even in a place to have a conversation. Yeah. And so, and this is sort of what I find, what I was wondering about, and sort of thinking about Du Bois's contribution to critical white studies, is there a conception of whiteness that's salvageable as white in a way that sort of can look with sober eyes at the history of this country, the trauma that white supremacy has inflicted, the kind of people it's created, and still be able to be in the position to receive moral truths protected by second sight. Because of course, when Du Bois is writing about this, it's that he's like, it's coming from spaces that are so vulnerable, that are created in a context of omnipresent death and the threat of violence. And so there is this risk that comes from sharing it. And I think the only way that that risk is going to be mitigated is that there is a different kind of white person, like there's a different kind of moral subject. And I was just wondering, sort of, is it salvageable? What would that be like?
Using Du Bois as my point of departure, I submit to you that Du Bois wrote arguably one of the first biographies of John Brown in the history of the United States of America. He published it in 1909. As you know, the latest edition has a foreword by David Roediger. So a lot of the hip white folk who really want to evolve into authentic anti-racist allies understand that Du Bois was giving them a gift. Du Bois was thinking about them too. Du Bois is saying with his magisterial work, The Souls of White Folk, because most people, they know Du Bois wrote The Souls of Black Folk, but they don't realize that Du Bois is such a unique figure. He not only inaugurates what's called Black studies, he also inaugurates critical white studies. David Roediger says so. Tim Wise says so. Peggy McIntosh, all of them, all these major figures in critical white studies, you got to deal with Du Bois, because Du Bois is saying there's a tendency for white people to think of themselves as raceless or race neutral, or somehow their race is universal. It is so ubiquitous. It is so prevalent. It is so pervasive that it just evaporates into the ether. And we all should be, right? Du Bois calls it out. See, Du Bois names it. What Du Bois is critiquing is white supremacy, the thought that somehow white folk are superior and non-white folk are inferior. And you and I both know in the European conceptions of race, the opposite of white, Elvira, now what's the opposite of white? Black. Think about it. So again, Du Bois is saying those people who are Black, they have that positionality, they have that standpoint of Blackness, that experience of Blackness. They might have some special truths to speak to the white world. And to really address your question more directly. Yes, and I want to say this in the most full-throated fashion, and I want to say it as a radical humanist, as a revolutionary humanist. Yes, I believe that white folk are redeemable. Some people are perhaps unwittingly white supremacists, and some people are consciously. They go out of their way to do it. And it's those unwitting folks, if we could at least have a forum, have a dialogue like this, that's what also gives me a bit of hope. The fact that together we're naming whiteness. So we're something that really sort of works behind the scenes. We're centering it and talking about the way it impacts not simply non-white folk, but white folk. It dehumanizes them. They actually think that they are superior if they sort of embrace white supremacist thought. They actually end up thinking that they're superior when they actually, most instances, are quite mediocre, are quite not, and not in any way whatsoever superior, right? And if they really sort of engage it on a level, it'd be like, wow, certain people do this, might be doing this better, that better. And so that's a more of an open sort of humanist understanding of the world, as opposed to really having this false conception of yourself that you're somehow superior to everybody else. Come on now. And so for me, part of this project, when Du Bois writes in The Souls of White Folk, it's actually about saving white souls. See, The Souls of Black Folk is about saving Black souls from the damage, from the distortion, from the dehumanization, if you will, of white supremacy. The Souls of White Folks, he's up to something very similar. It's a love letter to white people, to some of those white school teachers who helped him get to Fisk University when his mother passed away, to some of those white faculty, those professors, and the white folks that he actually chartered and helped establish the NAACP with. Elvira, what if secretly there's been a long tradition of white anti-racists in the United States of America? See, during the time of enslavement, they called them abolitionists. Du Bois is saying, how is it that we can go from kindergarten through 12th grade, graduate high school, and most white children learn nothing about abolitionists? What about all those white folk involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, who was right there with Martin Luther King and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Septima Clark? They was right. You can look at the pictures. There are some white folk who they was really trying to unlearn anti-Black racism. They were trying to disrupt anti-Black racism. What if I understand part of my special task as a professor of so-called Black studies is also to do critical white studies. And what if I get that from William Edward Burghardt Du Bois? What if, as a model, Du Bois actually praxeologically allowed, when I study his praxis, it actually gives me a model to not simply do Black studies, but to help white folk get in touch with their humanity, realizing that white supremacy dehumanizes us all. I say the same thing about patriarchy. Patriarchy, yes, it does. It dehumanizes us all. It primarily, it pointedly impacts women, but it also, men have a puffed up sense of self. They actually, let me tell you something, Elvira, if Serena Williams Zoom bombed us right now, and Serena challenged me to an arm wrestling match, you should put your money. If you betting, you bet on Sister Serena. Don't bet on me. It ain't much I can do with this, right? So again, it gives men a puffed up sense of their self, like they're somehow intellectually and physically superior to women. Come on. If Angela Davis Zoom bombs us right now and just checks into the I'm gonna shut my mouth. There's nobody more brilliant. There's no philosopher working, I believe, more brilliant than Angela Davis. So again, I'm trying to keep it real. You know, I'm really deep into hip hop. I'm a musician, by the way. So hip hop, in the hip hop aesthetic, we have this concept of keeping it real. If we're going to really keep it real, there are some things coming out of Europe that I really admire. There are some things coming out of Asia that I really admire. There are some things coming out of Latin America that I can use and adapt as an African American. Oh yes, there's some things coming out of the Caribbean, out of Africa. Right? So what if I'm actually giving you a model, much like Du Bois gave me, of a radical humanist? That yes, I'm deeply and profoundly grounded in African American culture, but I'm also a global citizen. I want to learn what I can from anyone and anywhere, if it's progressive now. I'm not trying to learn the negative stuff, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to learn the progressive things.
Yeah, it makes me think of Du Bois when he describes his student days in Berlin, and he was dancing with a German woman, and he's like, and then it dawned on me, the white people are just ordinary human beings. Is that possible? And and part of that is that just the socio-historical contingency of the development of whiteness. Yes. And in different political contexts where the organization and understanding of racial power is different, it's going to manifest differently, and one is going to be read differently. And it was just hearing, and it was the moment in Du Bois where I just laughed out loud in the way he
Can I court controversy with you and say we have almost the exact same moment when Malcolm X goes to Mecca? It's in the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he said, I prayed right alongside blonde-haired and blue-eyed Muslims. Something fundamentally changed. That's a distinctly Black existential moment when you realize that whiteness is a social construct. If white folks really have constructed Blackness, right, or really sort of anti-Black conceptions of Blackness, by the way, right, then at the same time, what happens when African people, Black people have these aha moments where they realize, wow, they put their pants legs on one leg at a time, just like we do. They bleed just like we do. They got to eat, and they love and laugh, and just like we do. Boom, boom, boom. When we demystify white supremacy, only then do we have the possibility of real, fruitful human relations and interactions, and something that's core to your work, democracy. See, I'm not interested, as the great Charles Mills, I'm not interested in living in some type of majoritarian conception of democracy. I want to live in a democratic society. This is what Du Bois says in Dark Water, 1920. I want to live in a democratic society where even the most minority, the smallest group, has a seat at the table. See, that's the kind of, I want to live in a post-white supremacist society. I want to live in a post-patriarchal society. I want to live in a society where people can live out loud if they're queer, if they're trans. I want to live in a society where non-white immigrants are not dismissed and brutalized, right? They're not ostracized. In this country, also in Europe, we can see the way non-white immigrants are treated. Listen, it wouldn't be no white people over here if they wouldn't, most of these people came through Ellis Island. So, I mean, talk about immigration. Why is it white immigrants are treated differently than non-white immigrants. We just saw what happened with the Haitian immigrants here, right? Du Bois speaks to that as well, in ways that sometimes a Michel Foucault may not, in ways that sometimes a Habermas may not, a Marcuse may not. Du Bois is actually putting things on the philosophical agenda. That can I ask you a rhetorical question? Could you name the philosopher that really put the philosophical study of race and racism on the modern philosophical agenda prior to William Edward Bernard Du Bois? I'm just asking you a question now, and you got big time degrees. Come on, please talk to me.
It has to be Du Bois, absolutely.
Do you understand what I'm saying? So that in and of itself, if Du Bois only did race, you can notice I devoted 2 chapters to race, one on blackness and one on whiteness. If Du Bois only was the originator, one of the major progenitors of the philosophy of race, that in and of itself should make him part of every philosophical curriculum around the world. But he went further. And the damnation of women. He also grapples with patriarchy. He also grapples with misogyny. He also grapples with the racial colonization of gender. Elvira, is my mic on? Can they hear me? You know what I mean? Can they hear what I'm saying? I'm pleading to the world.
Yeah, I still want to talk about so much. I'm worried we're running out of time, but let me just let me just raise it. And really it's by way of admiration and praise. Your work on sort of presenting what Du Bois did and his contribution to Black feminist philosophy, and specifically describing and reconstructing his bottom-up approach to social transformation that puts Black women at the center of democratic life, doing the difficult work of political transformation, and yet being consistently unacknowledged. I think there's this method that is so important to what Du Bois is doing in Darkwater, and just on the whole of how he's reimagining feminist thought, that is so important, I think, to bring out in the way that you have, while at the same time being honest about his own personal limitations, his interpersonal dealings with Black women. And I know we don't have much time left, but I would love to hear you speak to Du Bois's democratic socialism. And specifically, I was mentioning earlier, I loved your treatment of how he visits the Soviet Union and sort of becomes enamored by it. And there's so much work, I think, here that's important, is sort of bringing out the later elements of Du Bois as his radical political philosophy develops.
I really, really appreciate the question. Let me begin, and I'm going to try to be succinct. I'm a jazz musician, so I often play over the bars, I play through the changes and all that, but I'm going to try to be succinct. With respect to Du Bois's critique of patriarchy, number one, it's important just to acknowledge it. Now, where did he get it? See, I'm more interested in the origins of it. I'm an intellectual historian. Du Bois, when Du Bois's mother died on March 23rd, 1885, he was only 16 years old. An organization, or several organizations of church women, African-American church women, began to help this orphaned boy out. And they're called the Black Women's Club Movement. And the Black Women's Club Movement, that is how Du Bois was able to get 2 BAs, 2 MAs, and 2 PhDs by the time he was 27 years old. They funded his scholarship, and that organization was incorporated in 1895, and they called it, wait for it, the National Association of Colored Women. Du Bois is paying mute tribute to his surrogate mothers when he calls his organization the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So most people don't actually realize, much like myself, raised primarily, exclusively by African-American women, my grandmothers and my mother. So what about, much like myself, Du Bois is raised, his life begins on deeply and profoundly Black feminist note. So he's seeing the experiences. Now he's still socialized, much like myself, to be a sexist in the American society. So you're that's a contradiction. And Du Bois sometimes would court controversy. He would actually put his contradictions out there And I think that there's a kind of radical intellectual honesty that goes on with Du Bois, where some people mask it. Du Bois actually disagrees with himself in print, which is like the hallmark of a real intellectual as opposed to an academic. An academic is just going to hope you don't read that article that they published 30 years ago where they were saying queerphobic and transphobic things. So Du Bois actually disagrees with himself in print. It's something that Jürgen Habermas talks about, conceptual self-clarification. This is one of the reasons that Habermas says that he writes so much, right? He's trying to get clear with himself. Du Bois was a very similar figure, trained in a very similar intellectual milieu in Germany, by the way. So that is the Damnation of Women chapter 4, before I go into chapter 5, but just sort of grappling with understanding that Du Bois is critiquing the racialization of gender. See, to be racially gendered is different than people just saying, oh, woman. No, see, there's a racial signifier. People will say, oh, no, the Mexican woman. They'll say, no, the Asian American woman, if they're talking about anybody other than white women. Du Bois understood that very early on, the racialization of gender, right? We're also grappling then with the racialization of capitalism, the racialization of colonialism. By the time we get to chapter 5, you can see there's this triad of racism, capitalism, and colonialism. In Du Bois's thought, there's no way to delink those by the time we get to his magisterial work, Black Reconstruction, 1935, through which Cedric Robinson argues he helps to inaugurate what's called Black Marxism. This is a kind of Marxism that is as critical of racism as it is of capitalism. It is as critical of racial colonialism and racial capitalism as it is of sort of capitalism in some kind of general sense, as though, I mean, could you even have modern capitalism without racial colonialism? Like, see, Du Bois is asking those kinds of questions that very few philosophers, if any, prior to him, are really asking those kind of, what about the intersection? How is racism intersecting with capitalism? How is racism intersecting with sexism? How is racism intersecting with colonialism and so on and so forth? That's at the heart of Du Bois's entire discourse, right? And for me, that's what's so provocative, intellectually provocative about his work. And then Elvira, that's also why his work remains relevant to this day. Why? Because we've actually named it. We understand that we have identity politics. We understand that there are various forms, systems of oppression that interlock and impact our lives. Sometimes I wonder what Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, what they would make of intersectionality. There seems to be something deeply and profoundly existential about us talking about the ways that we experience, both individually and collectively, racism or sexism, or capitalism, or colonialism, or heterosexism. How does heteronormativity impact even straight folk? They don't realize that they're out of touch with not only out of touch with their humanity, but their sexuality. How bunk might your sexuality be if you're not reading some of this fly Black queer studies, or Black trans studies, or just queer studies, trans studies in general? I think that there's a lot of subjugated knowledge that heterosexual folks could learn from queer folk, from trans folk. And again, epistemic openness. Notice that I'm underscoring for you, Elvira, that my conception of epistemic openness isn't just with respect to race, class, and gender. Also, the elephant in many rooms right now, sexuality.
Should we take some questions from the audience?
Let's do it. Oh, yeah.
So I have a question from Ulrich Freiberger. How does double consciousness relate to false consciousness?
False consciousness. This is good. If we're speaking of false consciousness in the sense of George Lukács and connecting that to Lukács' conception of reification, where literally you can make workers, like working class folks, you can manufacture their desires, their conception of sort of embracing bourgeois ideology, right? And so in that sense, I think, again, at the level of class and capitalism and class warfare and class struggle, I think that that's the connect between a kind of false consciousness. So when Du Bois in Double Consciousness talks about African Americans sort of not having the ability to see them, Black folk not having the ability to see themselves, but only through the eyes of the white world, of the people on the other side of the veil, on the people on the other side of the color line. He's also talking about the superimposition of the dominant ideology. This is where we can go to the work of Karl Marx. When Marx, and then when they talk about class warfare, and that there's a tendency for workers to embrace, sometimes unwittingly, the dominant ideology. And the dominant ideology of any society are the people that control the means of production. This is something that Du Bois points out in Black Reconstruction, but Du Bois also says, are these means of production being used to reproduce race as a social construct, and particularly white supremacy? So I think that's the difference, is that sometimes when I go to Western European philosophy, there's not a nuanced or any kind of deep conceptions or grappling with race and racism, certainly not a grappling with white supremacy. And so that's something I challenge. In fact, Elvira, where's Karl Marx's great treatise on race and racism? Where's Michel Foucault's great treatise on race? Where's Habermas's? I mean, this is amazing.
Habermas is racist to talk about race.
You see what I'm saying?
This is part of the sort of the German social theory tradition, and a fear, I think, ultimately to confront the political violence of the 20th century, because it's race-based, and there's no existing, as far as where he's standing, he feels like he has no concepts available to find the language to talk about what happened.
So one wonders what would happen if Habermas would actually read Du Bois, particularly Black Reconstruction, 1930. See, this is the whole point of my work. I see myself as a bridge, as somebody that has deep training in Western European philosophy, European American philosophy, but also my primary area, African American philosophy, Caribbean philosophy, African philosophy. I'm actually trying to be a bridge and saying, what would have happened if Foucault had actually read Fanon? If Derrida had actually read Du Bois, right? Although Derrida actually does do an Algerian Jew, so he actually does make some contributions to the study of race, to be perfect. If you really, really read his work, it's really interesting what other archives, all I'm saying, other archives can open up when we actually have that dialogue. Stop talking about it and let's start doing it.
Yeah, it seems like the quote unquote empirical conception of the world that's operating in a lot of 20th century Anglo-European philosophy has no Black people in it, no people of color, no traditions outside of itself. And so you have this completely, I think, untenable, strange conception of what the world is and to whom the theory applies. And I think this is the power of bridge work, is that if these theories are going to be worth their salt, if they're going to be helpful to anybody, they have to respond to the lived experiences of the people in it. And that's always going to be the point where finding a language to talk about race, to talk about white supremacy and racial power, it's going to be necessary. And Marx didn't, and there's so many ways I think that philosophers have developed to sort of wave their hands of like, I have this other concept where I don't need to do this. And so something like false consciousness, and sort of my view, Marx is operating in a way that he really harkens back to Locke, where he has this view that we're these original agents that want to accumulate as part of our natural desires. And part of sort of when we think about what the phenomenon of double consciousness is that it's giving us just a completely different anthropology of like who the human being is, that it's not just that we're interested in the accumulation of things by nature, as much as we are in a certain form of social embodiment that's racialized, so that if I'm in a position where maybe I don't have enough things, but I get to be white, that's enough of an interest or an incentive for me to rationalize a system where I essentially get nothing. And that I think these are these moments where it shows concepts unraveling, even concept like, I'm a Marxist, like I'm a version of it. There's so much there that's important, but putting it in conversation with Du Bois is that we get I think, much more sophisticated and tenable picture.
What you just said, Du Bois has a concept for that. It's called the wages of whiteness. So when you talk about, even though somebody may be poor, white and poor, he said there's a psychological wage. So even then, just having that kind of confidence, knowing that if you go to the police, you actually have a greater chance of getting justice, even if you're working class white, compared to, you know, a middle class African American, or you know, middle class Mexican American, so on and so forth. Those are the wages of whiteness. This is the psychological wage that people get from it. So understanding that is important even for the Marxists. Du Bois titled it in a way that should be more receptive to the Marxists, but they've missed the boat sometimes by creating that dialogue. And that's what I tried to do in my book, Africana Critical Theory, was to actually create a dialogue between Africana philosophy and the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, right?
Should we take another question?
Please, bring it on.
Reiland, this is for you. Anonymous attendee writes, I am interested in the relationship between Du Bois's gift theory and Black feminist thought's tenet of multiple jeopardy. What kinds of generative rehumanization practices, processes, and experiences can be made possible through this relationship?
This is such a powerful question. I want to thank you for the question. I believe that Du Bois's gift theory, there's a radical humanist subtext to it. He's not simply saying at the end of Souls of Black Folk that it's only Black folk who have gifts or who are part of this gift theory. If we universalize Du Bois's thought, he's saying that everybody, that means people with different abilities, who they call them disabled, people who are immigrants, people who, you know, I mean, just people from a lot of different backgrounds have gifts and contributions to make. Now, when we talk about what started out as double jeopardy with Francis Beale and then becomes multiple jeopardy with Deborah King in 1988, multiple jeopardy, I believe Professor King is talking about the ways in which African-American women in particular experience. Now, so this is, notice this is 88, Kimberly Crenshaw is going to drop intersectionality in 1989. So look at what's going on in the 80s. This is a brimming period for Black feminist thought, and critical, radical Black feminist thought. And so there's a sense in which Deborah King, I see multiple jeopardy as a prelude to intersectionality, 1989. And this is that Black women have a consciousness of their race, they have a consciousness of their gender, they have a consciousness of their class, of their sexuality, of their immigration status, of their educational level, I mean, of their religiosity, right? Or spirituality, because we need to make it more expansive, because all of us don't fit in the little boxes called religion, right? Could be something much broader than that. And so she's saying that multiple consciousness, that it's textured. There are many different layers, there are many different levels to women's experiences. And it's really important to acknowledge that race is operative. It's not simply gendered. So there's a tendency, at least in America, when people start talking about American feminism, there's a tendency to really, to only act as though feminism is about gender justice, right? Which obviously primarily, right? This is great. But for many Black feminists, for many Chicanx feminists, for many Asian American feminists, for many indigenous or red feminists, feminism is qualitative. That's a qualitatively different kind of theory and praxis, because there's a simultaneous, see, it's the simultaneity, it's the relationality at the heart of my conception of intersectionality. They're struggling for not simply gender justice, but also racial justice, also economic justice, also, wait for it, one of the key components of the Black Lives Matter movement, which most people miss, environmental justice. Like, how do we grapple with environmental racism? The fact that the zip codes that are the most polluted in the United States of America disproportionately have more non-white people in them. They're building the factories near working class and underclass non-white folk. And so you have higher rates of cancer and other ailments coming out of these communities. And so I think that Du Bois is going to say that what we have to do is be epistemically open ourselves to the knowledge that is coming from incredibly marginalized groups, especially women, right? Especially women. And in fact, I'm gonna say it slow. In The Damnation of Women, 1920, by W.E.B. Du Bois, he says that Black women in particular are the litmus test for American democracy. He said, you will know when you really achieve democracy in this society when Black women, why? He says that they are considered the opposite of white, they're Black, they're considered the opposite of men, women. So Du Bois is already grappling with binaries, if you will. He's already sort of deconstructing right? Disrupting a bunch of binaries. He said Black women disproportionately are incredibly poor, working class, and underclass. So they are the exact, almost the opposite. And from the white supremacist patriarchal point of view, they are the opposite of the wealthy, straight white males, bourgeois white males, who wrote the United States Constitution, created the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, so on and so forth. They are in a position that is so far removed from the people that came up with this Constitution, that conceived of American democracy. He said, only then, only when they experience democracy, only then will you actually have democracy. People are talking about democracy. Let us go back to something that John Rawls taught us, right? John Rawls says, listen, he says, now, y'all don't understand this thing. It doesn't really matter whether the people are living in democracy. What matters more is if you can make them think that they're living in a democratic society. Wag the dog, anybody? I mean, see, they playing games. See, they, and we see this has been happening the last election, anybody? Or the election before that one, anybody in America? Hello?
Yeah. And it becomes a deflection, a way of pivoting, so you don't actually have to have a conversation or look at the world from the point of view of the most respected and most vulnerable groups. Another question for you, Dr. Rabaka. Kali Harris asks, what most delighted or surprised you about Du Bois's thought or life as you wrote this book?
Oh, gosh, that is such a profound question. I've never been asked that question before. Succinctly, it is Du Bois's trajectory. One of the things that really touched me the first time I read the autobiography of W.E.B Du Bois, I read that the summer before I started high school, along with the autobiography of Malcolm X and the autobiography of Angela Davis. So I'm very into autobiography. But for me, it was the way that Du Bois narrated his intellectual trajectory and what he didn't put in his autobiography, right? I'm talking about the centennial autobiography, the last one that came out February 23rd, 1968, that Martin Luther King Jr., as you all know, keynoted Du Bois's 100th birthday party at Carnegie Hall. And so the fact that he sort of orchestrated, much like Duke Ellington, my absolute favorite composer. So Du Bois orchestrated his life to a certain extent. And when you get to a manuscript, as we discussed earlier, like Russia and America, something that the publishers rejected, and it makes you kind of cringe, not simply the sort of public image of Du Bois, but behind the scenes. Certainly when we talk about Du Bois's gender politics, all the extramarital affairs, even though you're sort of mouthing, right? You're talking publicly. You're the most prominent man in America in terms of women achieving the right to vote, blah, 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 blah. But privately, there's something different going on there. And it's sort of reconciling those. For me, it was taking the deep dive into the Du Bois papers at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which I've been going to since about 1995, and sort of working in those papers and just all of the little things that you might not, because, Du Bois had a very, he orchestrated his public persona, was very, very, together or whatever. And so sort of seeing some of how he was human. Let me just say that, how Du Bois made mistakes, how there were missteps, and how Du Bois actually, if you read some of his diary entries, he sought to learn the lessons from the mistakes that he made. Now, if that's not what a bona fide intellectual is, if that is not authentic intellect, nothing is. The fact that you can learn from your mistakes, and over time, certainly by the time he married Shirley Graham Du Bois, he sort of married up with one of his intellectual equals, somebody who was a real Renaissance woman. If you go to Gerald Horns' book called Race Woman on Shirley Graham Du Bois, you will see that was more wow. Like Du Bois is sort of evolved in terms of his racial politics, but also his gender politics, and certainly with Black Reconstruction, his class politics, so on and so forth.
Shall we take another question?
Yes.
All righty. Viraf Mehta, apologies if I've mispronounced your name, asks, first of all, thank you for this excellent discussion. I'd like to hear what you think about what an academy would look like that would promote public intellectualism.
I think about Du Bois's petition to HBCUs to start a consortium. He began to find out that a lot of historically Black colleges and universities seem to be, even though he was critical of Washington, it seemed to be relegating African Americans to a lot of sort of manual labor positions and everything. And so I think that Du Bois would want an academy where people could actually choose to learn about things that would edify them and that would actually help them toward their self-actualization, as opposed to a lot of people choose degrees, a lot of youth, a lot of people between 18 and 22 years old, they choose degrees based on how much money that degree can help them make once they get out of university. So for me, it would be really sort of a broad training where I had the good fortune, even though I come from the projects and now I'm in the professorate. I think that had I not been a jazz musician, had I not started out as a gospel musician in the Black church, and also as a youth jazz musician, that's how a kid like me from the projects was able to go to arguably the most elite schools, in the city that I grew up in, was purely based on talent. It was via art. It was through art, right? And so certainly, this I felt very much like the Du Bois I read in The Souls of Black Folk and in his autobiography. I was very alienated. I was the only little Black kid in these elite schools, getting arts education and everything. And so I started to seek out models. I needed to consciously do that. So this is the kind of double duty I took on as a jazz musician. But I think that, again, it would be a space where I wouldn't have had to sort of get a scholarship based on the art. I mean, that's literally only reason I'm here right now is because I can swing, I mean, because I love Billie Holiday, I love Nina Simone, I love Ella Fitzgerald and John Coltrane and Miles Davis and Charles Mingus and Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. I could just do this all day long. But I think that it was my relationship to the fact that African Americans, as a musicologist now, so I'm going to suspend my work as a philosophy, public philosophy. Watch this. As a musicologist, I'm preoccupied with the fact that African Americans have created 15 forms of Black popular music. I just think that, like, literally African Americans are providing the soundtrack to American history and culture, going back all the way back to the enslavement. If you start thinking about spirituals, work songs, field hollers, and coming all the way forward through blues and jazz and gospel music and rhythm and blues and rock and roll. Yes, I said rock and roll is an African-American originated musical form, and funk music and even Afro disco music. I love some Donna Summer, and then rap music and hip hop culture. Yeah, and I'm really, really into soul music. But yeah, I mean, so for me, I just think that there's something very powerful. And listen, a lot of people don't understand how a musicologist can also be a Du Bois scholar. The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois's hit book, has 14 chapters. The last chapter is called The Sorrow Songs. And with that chapter, on the spirituals, it is a chapter on the spirituals. Most people acknowledge that modern African-American musicology starts with Du Bois. Fascinating. I mean, just talk about polymathic. Come on, right?